La classe operaia accompagna l'attacco, Stato e padroni non la possono fermare, niente operai curvi più a lavorare, ma tutti uniti siamo pronti a lottare. Non lavoro salariato, unità di tutti gli operai, il comunismo è il nostro programma, con il partito conquistiamo il potere, Stato e padroni, fate attenzione, nasce il partito dell'insurrezione, potere operaio e rivoluzione, Angelo secondo.
Hello, welcome to the fourth episode of the Minor Compositions podcast. And here today we are joined with Steve Wright. Now, I don't usually like introducing people through formal titles or things like that. So I'm going to introduce Steve through a random story that I happen to like, which is in 2005, I had visited you in Melbourne. And I think you were quite busy at the time because you had young children. And I wanted to go there to sort of ask you. I was working my PhD and starting to do work in sort of the history of autonomism. And so we ended up going with your daughter to the zoo.
Uh-huh.
And so my memory of our conversation is that I'd be asking you something about Negri, and then your daughter would be like, "Daddy, look at the polar bear." So since then, whenever I think about Negri, I think about polar bears.
Okay. There are worse associations to have, I imagine. But...
Well, it made sense because then when I met him in Palermo a number of years later, he was wearing a jacket with a polar bear on it. So I was like, "Aha! Your daughter knew." Anyways, that is sort of random and anecdotal, and perhaps not the most useful thing to start with. But so we're joined today by Steve Wright, who, as you were. I would probably say that you've written the authoritative history of autonomy in English, and at which point you were correctly pointing out that that's a bit like your son saying that that you are his best father because you are in fact his only father.
Yes, I hope that will change. I hope there will be more authoritative accounts of Operaismo and autonomy in English. Yeah, that would be great. I really look forward to that.
Well, maybe we can start with that as a sort of thought. I can somewhat understand when you were first writing a book, which I'm guessing started as a PhD.
Yep.
I can understand when you were first working on that, in let's say in the 90s.
No, I started 40 years ago.
Okay, sorry.
No. In 1982, I started working on it.
So I can understand when you're starting at that point. The history of a certain, let's say, of Operaismo and autonomy in Italy is a relatively, let's say, a minor current in politics and debates around labor or the history, or changing nature of class composition, it's. But by the point when the book comes out in 2003, and what we're going to now, concepts coming from people like Negri, Lazzarato, Berardi, all these characters, I wouldn't say they're hegemonic, but they are part of at least a minor academic publishing industry, right? So it is somewhat interesting that despite that, there hasn't been a sort of like. Well, it's interesting. So there's the way that these concepts have circulated and been popularized and used much more broadly, but the histories of where they come from, the movements that they emerge from, still remains much less explored. And I'm curious. I mean, maybe it's not the best starting point, but why that is? Why it's sort of like, we'll talk about these ideas, but we'll talk about where they came from as much. Do you have any idea on that, or
one of the things I pondered? I mean, if I want to be really cynical for a moment, which is hopefully out of character for me, when my first book appeared, that was in the wake of Empire. And I jokingly said with friends that given how well Empire had sold, that maybe I'd be able to retire on the back of it with my own book. But at least, the cynical answer is to say that there is no real broad interest in where these ideas come from. But I don't think that's true, because in certain circles, and the sort of people that I'd hoped would read what I've written are certainly often interested in where these ideas come from. But in terms of a broader commercial market, I think there is much less interest in the history of autonomia or the history of struggles in the 60s and 70s than there are in the ideas of some of the individuals who've emerged out of it, talking more about how they perceive the situation in the 21st century. So rightly or wrongly, I think there's not a great interest. I mean, and now I'm just, Tim Murphy, for example, wrote a fine book about Negri and situates his intellectual trajectory historically. But most of the stuff that I have seen tends to focus much more on Negri's writings and since the 90s, for example. But maybe I'm looking in the wrong place too. That's possible. As just picking on Negri as one obvious.
I read Tim's book on Negri, and actually I really like it, particularly the first chapter where he's talking about Negri's writing on the state in the 1960s. And that's super useful for people who can't read Italian, because none of that stuff has been really translated, if I remember correctly.
A little bit of it appeared in a book that Negri and Hart put together before Empire. Now it's Labours of Dionysus, I think. So I think there's one or two chapters in there that come in part from Negri's work in the early 60s on the state. But you're right, or the state form. But you're certainly right that that material is still that, and a very interesting interview that he did in 1978, a book-length interview, are two of the things that still haven't appeared in English from the 1970s. So, yeah.
Okay, well, yeah. So if you start with this sort of idea that there is this strange disjunction between interest in sort of the social context, the histories of struggles which these ideas come from, I think that sort of nicely sets up the particular reason why I wanted to have a chat with you now, which was to talk about your new book. Well, I think, can we still call it new, because it came out last year, right?
Yeah, I'm still calling it my new book. It's coming out in paperback, allegedly with Haymarket in a few months, so it'll come out again. So it'll be my forthcoming book in that sense. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think this is going to be the one which is going to be the commercial success, and everyone's going to put it on their coffee table. But it's called The Weight of the World, and what I particularly like about it is the way what you're doing here is sort of not just looking at the history of particular movements in the 60s and 70s, but also looking at particularly about their kinds of print production and media production, and how that forms a particular story about the movements. Would that be a sort of a like?
Yeah, sure. It's very much seeing the movement that I'd written about in 20 odd years ago. Well, sorry, because I wrote it 30 to 40 years ago. I actually wrote what became the first draft of that book, but what appeared 20 years ago, I revisited exactly the same time frame, but now looking from what I see as a quite different perspective in terms of the kinds of documents that are created and used. But above all, as you said, focusing on print, because print to me seemed so crucial. And I think possibly what might make this work of some interest to people who are interested in radical social movements and perhaps not that interested in Operaismo as such is print was very much the dominant form of communication and self-expression of revolutionary radical movements in the 20th century. I think I don't think many radical movements broke into, well, except for in some instances in Europe in the 1970s, which I touch upon in the book in terms of radio, but certainly in terms of television, I think only in Portugal, possibly, maybe other places like Germany or Northern Europe, there might have been some experiments with television. But print really dominated the way in which these movements communicated or attempted to communicate.
So, taking a perspective, looking much more at the let's say this history of print production, particularly, let's start with sort of early autonomy or sorry, early Operaismo from, let's say, the mid 60s to up to the 70s. When you change your focus to look much more at their print production in particular, what does this tell us? What does this show us that we wouldn't see if we were looking at, I don't know, history of individuals or history of organizations?
Well, I think because print was so central to how people in the workerist circles engaged in their political activity, that the production of print materials defined, it wasn't the utterly central part of their activity, although probably the more marginal they were, the more important it was. And so I think it was sort of gauged against other sorts of activities as well. But I still think it was absolutely pivotal to what they were doing. So even, for example, in the production of leaflets around factories, whether it's near Venice in the petrochemical industry or the auto industry in Turin with Fiat, leaflets were absolutely central to how workerist and other far left militants attempted to communicate with those that they saw either needed their guidance in some cases or they believed needed their input of some sorts. But I think it was very much the stock in trade of all sorts of left-wing groups. And I think it continued to be at least up until the early 90s. I certainly spent my share of the 80s handing out leaflets, for better or worse, probably for worse. So what I find interesting is how the different forms change and how things like leaflets can be produced to attempt a kind of immediate result, but you can only do so much with a single piece of paper, maybe two-sided if you're lucky, but it's probably more likely you're only going to use one side of it. And so both the immediacy of being able to produce a leaflet if you have the means and to produce it quickly and in large numbers can possibly make a difference in certain circumstances. But there's also that whole genre. It doesn't, well, I was going to say it shapes. It shapes, but it certainly sets boundaries on what you can and can't say, presuming anyone's going to read what you're actually trying to communicate with them. And I think that's quite different, say, to a newspaper. That again, these organisations, certainly by the late 60s, were starting to develop. There were two regional newspapers in this current of politics in Italy by the late 60s, though they tended to be monthlies, but sometimes they were weeklies. And then by the early 70s across the far left in Italy, by the mid 70s, there were three daily newspapers, although none of them were particularly influenced by workerism or operaismo as a current, except perhaps with a lot of continua newspaper occasionally.
We have here kind of like a continuum going from, let's say, the kind of effort an organization needed to produce a flyer to intervene in a particular moment versus when you go to, let's say, producing a newspaper or a review. There seems to be something particular, I think, for you about the status or the place of the review at this moment. I think is that accurate? In what sense? In the 1960s and 70s, or yes.
I mean, again, with Italian workerism, reviews were probably the privileged kind of vehicle for, and it tended to be individually named theorists or intellectuals who were producing essays or articles of some sort that were then published in reviews. And part of what made that possible, I think, too, again, without trying to suggest that the technology shapes what people did, but a review is something that, if need be, like with later became a very big selling printed or commercially printed journal, but the Quaderni Piacentini, which was quite influential from the mid-60s onwards, that could still be ronioed, it could still be gestetnet to start with. So you didn't have to depend upon a contract with a publishing house, for example, in the same way that you did with the book in order to produce a review. And so even if you had it commercially printed, you could still, if you could get hold of the money that you needed, you could go and make a deal with a publisher or a printer to do a one-off version and then possibly more. So I think the fact that something like a review was within the capability of a group of a couple of dozen people or so made it possible. But I guess that still begs the question, why were people writing essay-type pieces of writing that then were presented in reviews? I mean, they were writing them, these people were writing them alongside the leaflets that they were writing as well. But because books really don't take off in this circle until, apart with a couple of important exceptions like Tronti's Workers and Capital, but and even that is a collection of essays, after all, that had mostly appeared elsewhere beforehand. So I guess it also, to talk about the review means to have to think about the essay as a particular genre as well. And one thing that I find strange, but possibly it's only strange to me because I don't know where to look, is I haven't found any kind of prolonged discussion in Marxist circles about essays as a particular kind of genre for political writing. And again, you think about the journals with the New Left from the mid-1950s onwards that have been so influential in many parts of the world, whether it's the New Left Review or Telos was really important to me up until the late 70s when I was a young person, or Radical America. So reviews were also a very important part of the broader New Left in many other parts of the world as well.
Or I suppose you could almost draw a sort of line of continuation of that idea with I'm not sure I'd call it a review, but something like semiotext. It would be a similar idea of bringing together a series of conversations around a topic or idea.
Yep. Yeah, no, semiotext is very interesting to think about in this light.
So it's kind of like you have a sort of continuum of sort of the development of going from the flyer or the particular intervention, or thinking here about a previous conversation with Nick Tobin about this, talking about, let's say, the pamphlet or the sort of like the shorter produced print object, and then how that develops into a format of the essay or the more extended development of an idea or an intervention, rather than a book. And how that also sort of is paralleled by needing to have a certain kind of organization to deal with sort of printing, legal requirements, and all these other sort of material matters of how you make the print objects, right?
Well, what I also find fascinating with it, what I think in part is behind it for me, is trying to understand the division of labour within a group of people committed to some kind of radical project, because essays tend to be written by individuals and leaflets can be written collectively to some degree. Newspapers, particularly left newspapers, usually need militants to hand them out. I mean, to some extent. I mean, one of the interesting things with the Italian cases that I talk about in terms of newspapers, particularly the Potere Operaio newspaper in the early 70s, was the extent to which it could be bought at newsstands, but that's I think possibly different to some of the left newspaper experiences that at least I'm familiar with in a place like Melbourne back in the 70s. I'm pretty sure I never saw any left newspapers on any newsstand outside a radical bookshop. But the division of labour I find really curious and intriguing, because how many people actually get to formulate what gets printed in each instance, and as well as the ways in which that gets disseminated, that can sometimes, if it's a book, then it's often left to the vagaries of the market or to bookshops, and in other cases with a leaflet, then it's handed out and you usually don't pay for a leaflet. Newspapers have a kind of intermediary place, and particularly in the Italian case, by the 70s, a practice had developed of, rather than putting a money amount on the newspaper, particularly if it was something of a smaller group and it wasn't a regular thing, unlike the daily newspapers, but putting political price. And so that presumably it was a donation that people would get, and the more you could screw out of somebody, the better, presumably. I mean, I can remember being in the local IWW 20 or so years ago, and we had quite what I thought was a really nicely produced newspaper, but everyone I knew, including me, was too embarrassed to try and sell it. So we would just end up giving it away when we had it at demos, or we'd leave it at places. So I think we were real failures in that respect. But
one thing I remember from reading a history of sort of the Black Panthers publications is I forget who said it, but at one point it was said the idea that like they didn't want to just give away their publications because they thought that if they just gave it to people, they wouldn't value them because they hadn't paid anything for it. So if you got someone to even make let's say pay a quarter or something, so there's something actually a small amount, that then they would sort of almost like then value the thing more.
That's why communism will never work. Sorry.
It's interesting psychology there.
Yeah, no. I do understand that. I mean, that there's a certain sense to that. That was probably our problem in the local Wobblies. We were downplaying the whole thing, perhaps. But we also, I think some of us didn't want to be seen as the kind of equivalent to the robotic types that we felt we were competing with from some of the Leninist groups. So, because the other thing about this whole, what I following the academic Kieran Trace have followed her in terming document work is just what people do with documents in social movements, and particularly printed ones in the 20th century. There's a lot of busy work in certain political groups in the past has been involved in producing newspapers. I mean, you get people out selling newspapers sometimes in some political circles because that keeps them occupied with their time. So,
well, I guess you can almost have. Okay, I haven't actually read the person's work you're talking about, but I'm thinking you could almost talk about different kinds of document work. So there's the kind of work or labor that goes into writing. There's a kind of work that goes into layout design and print production.
Yeah.
And there's the kind of layout work, so the kind of document work that goes into circulation, like actually getting the things into people's hands or into bookstores or into newspaper stands, whatever the case may be. And then there's the kind of document work that goes into, maybe this isn't document work, but goes into reading, understanding conversations that come out of how the documents circulate, whether they keep moving around or whether they end up just stopping or how they go on.
Document work, anything working with a document almost, I think, is document work. And using my work ID to move in and out of buildings is a form of document work in terms of using swipe access, I think. So, yeah.
So it's interesting you're talking about in terms of like whose voices get heard, who gets to be involved in certain things. So you probably have certain people who get to be doing the writing, certain people who are, let's say, doing the gazetteering, and certain people who are doing the sort of the handing out of leaflets or trying to hawk the papers, right?
Yep.
And that fits into the particular organization of how Operaismo develops over time.
And in the Italian movement of the 60s in particular, but into the 70s, that was heavily gendered as well. So but again, and I'm not sure that that's different to any other similar kind of radical movement anywhere else at the time, but which then inspired certain sorts of reactions. But the fact that there even was a phrase coined about, Gestetner angels, which typically tended to be associated with young women whose role it was to actually physically print this material and hand it out along with the men, and no doubt make coffee, and as I quote one or two people in the book, tidy up after the guys as well after long branch meetings. So that was something that I wanted to, and again, it's nothing original I'm doing. I'm just trying to bring together what other people have been talking about in other contexts, but I just wanted to focus it around working with documents because it seemed to throw so much light for me upon what political engagement at the time meant.
Well, it's also, something you think that if you're going to do an actual materialist analysis, you'd actually want to look at the history of the materials, right? So it seemed to me a pretty obvious thing to do. That do the conditions of production, do the organization of production, does it change what was produced?
And that's why that's a really good place to try and give a plug for my friend Jacopo Galiberti's book on design and Operaismo, which is coming out with Verso in the next year. I think it's called Images of Class, because in a way our two books complement each other. I've tried to look at documents in a different way to how I have in the past, and not simply focus upon content and text, but that's still a great deal of what I do. And Jacopo's book looks more than mine does, much, much more at the whole design process, the actual physical nature of the documents of various sides from a design and political perspective. And so I think he's someone perhaps you might want to think about talking with sometime in the future.
Sounds good. I read a bit of the work before. I remember that some of the circles, I think particularly around Negri, were sharing an office with the design group. Was it N-1? Or no, sorry, N Grupo?
Yeah, in Grupo, I think, yeah. Yeah, so there were all sorts of connections. Through some other people have done some interesting work. And again, Jacopo expands on that in terms of the connections between design and architecture circles, particularly, but not only in Florence, and the whole workerist networks as well in the 60s. So there's all sorts of intriguing kinds of things that are done there. And then you've got the connections to people like bookshop owners like Primo Moroni as well, who are really fascinating in terms of, again, having connections to others working in design and layout and so on.
This isn't exactly the same thing, but a few months ago I was reading a book about Basaglia and the sort of mental health reform efforts in the 70s. And one of the things I remember being a big deal around that book by Phil Foote, but he's talking about who got to be on the editorial boards of particular publishers, and how this was an extremely important thing, and how certain social networks of sort of ideas being developed were articulated through editorial boards. So they were in he was on the publishing board of I'm gonna say the name wrong. It's like Inaldi.
Inaldi, yeah.
Okay, I got it right.
Yeah, so good. It's a big book publishing company. Yeah, still is. Yeah. So that's another thing that I try to explore a little bit in terms of, maybe it sounds too grandiose, but trying to attempt some kind of materialist analysis of all of this is looking at the connections between these kinds of circles in the 1960s and 70s, and both the book industry in Italy, and then into the 70s in particular, academia, because academia became a place in which many of the leading lights of Operaismo were able to find employment in the 1970s, but in the 1960s, certainly many of them were working often in a casual or precarious kind of way as translators, or some of them as copy editors, and very few probably on prestigious bodies like the editorial advisory board for Einaudi, because that was very much a big deal in the Italian book trade, the kinds of intellectuals that Einaudi was able to recruit and have available on a regular basis to react to the various sorts of titles that the publishing firm was considering.
Perhaps in some ways, this sort of all our current discussions around people who are para-academics or have this sort of para-relationship to academic institutions or to the creative industries is not something that's actually new at all, but is something which was happening for a much longer time, like you're describing, where people have this sort of inside and outside relationship to other forms of employment. Or I think at some point you quote Tronti talking about one of the main ideas was a general refusal to be intellectuals.
Yeah, I'm just hesitating because it's both laudable, and I don't think anyone could actually accuse Tronti of actually challenging that role himself.
But it sounds cool.
Sorry.
But it sounds cool as a claim, the whole idea of
sure. So does the struggle against work or the refusal of labour. So what they mean in practice is often a little more complex. I wondered too whether in Tronti's particular case, the refusal of being an intellectual at that point of time wasn't so much in terms of challenging intellectual divisions of labour as so much as being a political militant rather than an intellectual. I don't know if that's what he was getting at, because the first time for a long time when I've heard the refusal to be labour, to be an intellectual, I've thought it about as refusing the privileges and refusing the division of labour that is premised or that underlies the existence of intellectuals as a supposedly separate layer within society. But now that you've raised it again, and I'm thinking about the moment in which he said this in around 1965, 66, then I wonder if it's much more about, we want, I don't know, fewer Einsteins and more Lenins is possibly what Tronti was talking about. I don't know. Although whether we could deny that Lenin was an intellectual, but I think that would be foolish, but he was a lot more than an intellectual. I mean, he was a sort of political man of action before anything else.
I think I would broadly agree with that. I think it's, to me, it reads as a call to sort of abandon any conception of intellectual work or cultural production, which is separated from or not part of a form of political struggle. So there is no working class culture aside from the culture produced the working class struggle.
And it's interesting that it doesn't quite become the kind of there was an Auden poem from the early 30s that I used to know a bit of, which was, the premise of it seemed to be all about the good things of life and how they had to be sacrificed now for the struggle. Again, I'm just thinking in the book at one point I quote Oreste Scalzone, who was an important militant in workerist circles, first in the student movement in the late 60s and by the late 70s in Autonomia, but saying that his life was so much 24/7 being a political militant. He didn't get to read books. He didn't get to climb mountains or visit art galleries, and that later he saw this as an unacceptable kind of price that had been paid. But I don't know. I don't know if that's part of it too at that moment. Because again, I think things are very different by the 70s when enjoyment, pleasure start to be raised within Italian and other radical social movements as things that should be sacrificed to militancy, but somehow should either challenge militancy or at least be combined with militancy. And that pleasure, and that unlike what Negri had said in the early 70s, that pleasure couldn't simply come from destroying the state and capital, but there was actually other kinds of pleasure that were worthwhile pursuing in their own right.
One thing I fixated on, and maybe just taking an overly optimistic view of it, is my impression has been, perhaps I'm wrong here, that is that there was a place for things like poetry and art in early Operaismo. And I'm thinking here particularly of this quote Tronti has, where it says something like the workers who were leafleting the factory during the day were reading Lukács's Soul and Form at night. And to me, that gives it, I thought that was a lovely idea of somehow that like literary theory and poetics were then somehow influencing, militant class struggle. But I have no idea whether this is actually something which was going on, or whether it's another idea which sounds cool but it's not historically borne out.
Well, I think what I remember that quote, and I could be wrong, was it's more that the militants who were intervening outside the factories were reading Soul and Form in the evening, and people like Sergio Bologna were literally translating Soul and Form into Italian in the early 60s, and he got in trouble. Again, it's something I talk about in a footnote in the book, but the publisher of the Italian edition of Soul and Form actually got someone to break into his room and steal the manuscript, what he had done, back and publish it as it was, because Bologna was spending too much time leafleting for Quaderni Rossi when he should have been doing his paid work translating Lukács. So I think, I'm not sure that Tronti was suggesting that many of the workers themselves were reading Soul and Form, but I'm sure there were many in the scheme of things who were as well at some point.
It's interesting you mentioned this sort of having to break in to steal the translation, because we won't get into it, but there's a very long and complex history of all of the failed efforts to get out a publication of Workers and Capital by Tronti, which fell apart multiple times and had translators who disappeared, or publishers who literally bought the rights and then sat on them for years and years and wouldn't publish the book.
Well, some other time maybe you can tell me about that, because at certain times in the last 20 years I've heard various rumours, but I imagine it goes back way before that. So, that would be interesting some other time.
It is a question.
And in a miniature version, that happened a little bit with history and class consciousness coming into Italian. And there were certainly brawls, almost brawls, within different circles or in and around the workerist camp as to who got to translate history and class consciousness in the end, or who got to translate the Grundrisse, or what publishing house the Grundrisse came out with, since it was an Italian workerist, Enzo Grillo, who translated the Grundrisse into Italian.
And again, this isn't a sort of main important thing, but I've often find it curious that Silvia Federici's PhD was about Lukács's aesthetics, and particularly the role of realism in his aesthetics. And I've always wondered sort of what role that plays in sort of what she goes on to do later, or at the same time, in terms of history of wages for housework and her other work. It seems to be quite distinct, but I'm guessing there is some sort of connection there.
That's something I don't know about. I'd like to know more. I mean, there are some of the earliest Italian material that I know of in the early 70s, again in Telos, about Lukács was coming from people like Daghini writing about different things to do with Lukács, although again it tended to focus on history and class consciousness. And I don't know enough about Silvia's personal history to know if that was something that she did before she got involved. And helping to develop the whole Wages for Housework project or something that came at the same time, or what that would be useful. Again, the whole experience of Operaismo, and particularly Wages for Housework outside Italy, is a history that's starting to be written in parts, but that's still something we don't know as much about as we could, those of us who are interested.
Yeah, sort of piecing together the different pieces of the puzzle that are available and saying, how do these things relate? Maybe another thing to ask you about, one quote or idea that you sort of come back to a few times is Lenin's idea that the newspaper provides a certain kind of scaffolding for sort of both intellectual production or not intellectual, but for print production in the party and organization. Would that be a fair rendering of it?
Yeah. The kind of organisational network you needed to build to have a national newspaper was this kind of organisational network that you needed to build a national organisation, and so that you could use the newspaper. And I don't think for Lenin it wasn't as instrumentalist as I'm making it sound, because the newspaper was important in its own right, but it also, by building up the networks and distribution and having reliable people to hand out materials and hand out the newspaper or sell the newspaper, maybe form reading groups around the newspaper. These are all things that were inseparable from building a political organisation, I think, as well as getting a kind of periphery for an organisation that might respond to the newspaper, and whether it's through letters or some other kind of feedback. So having a dialogue that way. So
what I was thinking about that is thinking about how different political orientations lend themselves to different kinds of, let's say,
right.
Engagement with this kind of work. So, for instance, let's say a more Leninist aspect of newspaper production is trying to amplify certain correct voices in the party line, right? And you can compare this to, let's say, the committees of correspondence or the people around CLR James in the US, which are trying to create a more sort of, let's say, interactive form of publication where you're embedding in forms of worker writing and storytelling, which is slightly different from, and that's not just reproducing the party line, but it's almost like trying to actually work out personal stories or orientations and then use that as a part of the publication process. Or does that make sense?
Yeah, well, but what I'm conscious of in reaction to that is I don't know enough about the experience of Russian pre-revolutionary newspapers on the level of being able to read what was in something like Pravda or Iskra, to know what the content was, because as someone who is very much not a Leninist, I still think Leninist practices were quite different before 1917 compared to afterwards. And so it wouldn't surprise me that those newspapers weren't simply about pushing a line that involved space for debate, for example, and at least before the revolution of 1917 itself. But I don't know. Again, I've read, because I don't have Russian, I've read what I can in the only languages I have, which is, but none of that material that I know of reprints any of those newspapers. I'd really like to find out what Bolshevik and Menshevik, but particularly Bolshevik newspapers actually had in them before 1917. I think that would be, and I could be completely wrong. We could just find that it constantly is telling people what they need to do or what to think, but I suspect it was more complex than that.
I think this is the point where I'm now having the voice of Jody Dean in my head telling me that my question relied upon a sort of caricature of Leninism, and I should actually be looking at that kind of detail. Anyway, sorry.
But again, I think after 1917, that caricature probably is more than justified. It's just how pre-1917 Bolshevism, to me, and it makes it all the more tragic, is quite different to what it became. I mean, in many respects, Yeah, the caricature isn't such a caricature by the 20s. And particularly after Lenin is dead, even though a lot of that stuff was still happening while he was alive. So anyway, that's my 5 cents. It doesn't mean.
Yeah. So to go to a slightly different direction, would you say the sort of the role of document work and the kind of materials produced changed in relation to when movements started engaging in forms of workers' inquiry? Like, were the print materials produced out of workers' inquiries different from the review or the newspaper, or were they all quite meshed together?
There's only one inquiry that I can think of that was published as a separate document in the 1960s. And again, that's all I can think of. It doesn't mean that there weren't others. And that's the Fiat is Our University, which was a pamphlet that came out with Feltrinelli in 1969, or it could be 69, I'm pretty sure. And that was mostly a selection of responses to a questionnaire that had been distributed by some of the minor characters. I mean, minor not in terms of what their actual importance might be, but they were certainly minor compared to the prominent players like Negri or Bologna by that stage. So for the most part, as far as I know, inquiries got written up as essays or as newspaper articles. And that's why in the book, I was trying to dig into the kinds of documents that I suspected existed to produce the final result of the inquiry, trying to find the actual questionnaires, for example, or the notes that were made by members of what became the Quaderni Rossi circle when they were interviewing Fiat workers in the early 1960s, because in that kind of field work, documents are produced that typically aren't ever publicly circulated, like the actual questionnaires themselves or the field notes. You know, something else is created from them, and that is the actual final form of the inquiry. So it was just by accident that a friend was looking for me in some files in an archive in Turin and found some of the original completed transcripts of interviews with Fiat workers that gave me a bit of an insight into that. But I'm just trying to think, I could be wrong. If the two people who actually listen to this have any interest and know, I'd be fascinated if they could point me to some form in which workers' inquiries in Italy appeared differently than what I've just said, because I'm always happy to be corrected. And during the period of Potere Operaio, I don't think many workers' inquiries were actually published. There were some were planned, and that's partly, in my mind, and I'm being too simplistic, but it still has a grain of truth of it, because I think by that stage the idea was, well, we already know what needs to be done. We learned that in the 1960s. Now we just need to assemble enough people on the ground to do something about it.
Well, I suppose that connects to the sort of different kinds of orientations you could have to doing an inquiry, where one orientation might say the point of inquiry is to find out information about working conditions, then act upon it. And if that is the orientation, then you could say, well, we have enough of it. We understand what's wrong, what is to be done. Let's just do it. And then you can have a different orientation to inquiry, which would say, actually, the point is almost like the consciousness created through the inquiry process and through co-research. And if that's your orientation, you don't finish because there's always more people to engage with and build with.
And I think that there's an important point to what you've just made, and I think that's why I, for a long time, just collapsed inquiry into co-research, but I don't think they're the same thing. And I think some people like Gigi Ruggiero and others have written some interesting things about how co-research is something that goes beyond the inquiry, and that Elquati in the early 60s onwards, really aspired to some kind of co-research that was worker-led, and that it would have a different kind of process than merely, assembling the facts of the situation. Although given the nature of the Italian mainstream left and labour movement in the early 60s, part of which just had no interest in what was actually happening, merely assembling the facts was a bit of a leap forward anyway. But I think you're right. I think, to me, that's part of the possible difference and between co-research and workers' inquiry, and also part of what makes co-research so much harder, I suspect. But that doesn't mean it's not worth aspiring towards.
But it's also interesting how this connects to, if I understand it correctly, the sort of debates within Italian sociology at the time between, let's say, the more Marxist-oriented sects and the more sort of, let's say, more Weberian-oriented approaches, based upon whether the question is an empirical inquiry or whether it's a political one, and how that sort of ends up shaping Italian sociology. Which is probably, if you were joking that this podcast will be listened to by 3 people, the podcast about Italian sociology of the 1960s probably only has about 2 listeners. But
what's intriguing is how what connections the people who became the Italian workers and the others that they worked with who took different kinds of directions, how intimately mixed up so many of them were with Italian post-war industrial sociology. And I've said post-war, but I guess it didn't really exist in any sort of recognisable form until after the Second World War. So people like Danilo Montaldi had all sorts of connections with prominent, or later to be prominent, sociologists, and quite a few of those people who were carving out industrial sociology in Italy from the 50s onwards were mixed up in the broader beginnings of the new left in that country as well, although some of them were more likely perhaps to be involved in the Socialist Party than sort of circles that I'm talking about. Or they were, some of the people I'm talking about in the late 50s were in sort of the youth wing of the Socialist Party and then moved away from it. But there was, and the other thing I guess is not to underestimate the kind of hostility in mainstream Communist Party culture to sociology at that time, that it was viewed by some as with great suspicion and as something associated with the United States and therefore dubious. And not all Communist Party people were like that, but
well, I can sort of understand that in the sense that I'm speaking of someone who for my sins works in a business school. If you look at the early history of sort of where management thought comes from, it comes from badly implemented and sort of simplified sociology. So I can understand that why you'd be suspicious, as someone on the left, why you'd be suspicious of this American functional sociology, because it just sounds like it sounds like the voice of the boss,
But I think even someone like Alquati or Montaldi wouldn't claim that they invented co-research, that both of them got a number of the ideas about it, even if they each made it their own, but from some of these left-wing Socialist Party sociologists who later became quite prominent or really helped found sociology in Italy after the war, whether it's Ferro Rotti or Alessandro Pizzorno. So the really big names tend to all be people who knew these younger proto-workerists in the late 60s, and they'd even at times engage with each other and have all sorts of chats. And then the people like Panzieri, because of his positioning in the late 50s in the Socialist Party, was I guess a big facilitator of that connection between the beginnings of industrial sociology and some of the people who later became workerists by the early to mid-60s.
So would it be fair to say that as we start to get into, let's say, into this early to 70s or mid 70s, that we aren't just looking at sort of like a change in political generation, but also maybe a change in how people relate to the kinds of media they're using, or change in sort of print production techniques, or sort of change in document work as well?
No, I think that's very true, and particularly by the 70s, I mean, people could get hold of things like cassettes much more easily, much more cheaply than they could before. So a local circle, even in a small town, could produce at the very least a cassetted small publication or its regular leaflets. And then radio makes such a big difference by the mid-70s in Italy. But offset printing, I think, also, even when people didn't run the print shops themselves, because I'm not sure that there was a similar sort of culture in Italy that I understand that there was in the United States and in Britain in the 70s, where there were more radical print shops than in Italy. So again, I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to correct it on this, but I don't think there was a comparison. But there was still, because offset printing was available, that, and also the influence of the American counterculture and of other kinds of countercultures in the 70s changed the very layout. If you look at something like the newspaper Rosso that Negri was associated with, it had all sorts of stylings that you wouldn't have seen in the 1960s workerist publication. It had, at certain points, it had uses of reds as well as black and white in its print, and there were cartoons and mashups of photos, collages, all sorts of things that were quite different. I mean, then you have something like Attraverso, which is publication produced by the Radio Alice people, which was kind of proto-punk in the way that it was actually laid out.
So I imagine you have a point where you have some of the things being produced at that point, and that for the people who were involved in the mid 60s would look at it and go, "What's going on here? This is quite alien to them."
Yeah, and I think for some of them, there was definitely generations within these movements as well, even if the generation might only be 5 or 6 years apart. But culturally, there were real. Oh, I'm just thinking, well, you compare some of the Marxist-Leninist newspapers of the period with some of these publications, but even the Volsci, the main grouping of Roman autonomists, their publications before 1977, they had a newspaper, an intermittent newspaper called Rivolta di Classe, Class Revolt. And that to me looked like any other kind of ML newspaper, and in terms of how it was laid out and the kind of headlines and the kind of stridency of the tone. But it almost had a kind of council communist tinge to its politics mixed in with its Maoism. And then you look at, the newspaper that they brought out as a monthly through 1978 and a bit beyond. And it's completely different stylistically. It's really smart. The articles are often humorous in a really sharp kind of way. They have reviews of places to eat, or places to hang out in Rome. And I don't think it's just a cynical ploy to do things differently, but it's hard to for me, it's hard to recognise that these two publications are produced by the same core of people, but there's quite a different shift. And maybe, in terms of going back to your original point, maybe a new generation of people had moved into the Volsci and were making a big difference here. But the person who did the layout for Volsci as a newspaper was the same person who did the layout in the early 70s for Potere Operaio. And that, again, was a striking newspaper, but it was a much sterner kind of publication. You would rarely see something taken out of a Marvel comic, for example, put into Potere Operaio, as you would see it quite regularly in I Volsci.
When I think about the history of Operaismo, one thing that's always is a quite important shift at this time is also sort of the sort of rise of autonomous feminism. For instance, around wage for housework and other let's say currents.
Yep.
Does that occur also in terms of print production as well, or radio production?
In terms of feminist circles?
Yes.
Yes, and particularly in the northeast of Italy. So there was a publication which, I guess it was Homeworkers, Le Opere della Casa. And that came out sometimes, usually it was commercially printed and it had been laid out. So I'm guessing someone had been paid to do the layout on professional typesetting equipment. But at least some of the issues were literally done on a typewriter and then assembled. So, but I would then wonder whether that was perhaps in some instances because of perhaps speed. That's something I never asked Paul de Fortunati, and I probably should, whether the difference sometimes was that did they want to get a particular issue out really quickly, or am I reading too much into that? Because maybe it just cost more to get it professionally typeset. Sometimes they had the money and sometimes they didn't. I guess also what's interesting about those feminist circles is that they drew on other kinds of forms of expression, such as songs that they wrote themselves and performed in a way that, you didn't. I mean, there was an anthem for the workers group, Workers' Power, Potere Operai, but then the feminists wrote to the same tune, but they wrote their own version of it. And it wasn't, I mean, there were other things they did where some of them deliberately sent up people like Negri in parody, but this wasn't written as a parody. It was written as kind of as a workers' feminist anthem instead. But by the mid-70s, I mean, the big groups had all fallen apart and there were lots of local initiatives taking place. So I think one important thing between the 70s and the 60s is that the revolutionary movement was just much bigger in Italy by then, but also there were, even if still minorities, there were a lot more people engaged in producing small journals and leaflets and other kinds of things, not under the direction of anybody at a national level compared to before. So there was quite a bit of innovation going on, including the workers' feminist circles that you're talking about as well.
And at this point, wouldn't there also be sort of a developing network of, like, let's call them comradely bookstores and other kinds of spaces like that? Definitely.
That's very much a mark of the 70s. And along with that, attempts by people like Primo Moroni, who headed a particularly influential bookshop in Milan, to establish distribution networks for these materials as well. So there are a number of attempts to organise that. And then people like Nani Ballestrini also attempting to bring together some of the smaller publishing outfits to give them, by the late 70s, an infrastructure where they could bring out books in a way that perhaps they couldn't if they were left to their own devices. So there was a publication enterprise called Aria that he helped found that allowed something like a dozen or so small publishing houses to bring books out on a regular basis. And many of them were autonomous, including Marxist-Leninists within the autonomous movement, but many of them, of those publishing houses, fell outside autonomy as well as a movement.
I suppose in a way, if you're sort of tracing the history of these various kinds of document work, it becomes actually a lot harder to do it then, because when you have, let's say, a national body working on one publication that does it at a certain rhythm, I won't say it's easy, but it's like it's fairly discrete, right? But when you have like 20, 30, 40, 50 different groups all doing different things, all localized, then it's a lot harder to sort of like trace out what they're doing because there's just so much of it.
Yeah, and I think in this book, which is I worked out twice as long as my first book, I still think I'm only scratching the surface. So hopefully other people will be doing work that goes beyond that, and maybe discover, I'm sure they will discover that some of the assumptions and generalizations that I made don't hold water, and they can come up with some useful examples that challenge what I might have said.
Well, to give you one example, which I'm not sure how it fits in exactly, but a book that we just published a translation of is the book Kicks, Spits, and Headers by Paulo Solier, who is a guy who was a factory metal worker in the late 60s and becomes a professional football player for Perugia in the 70s and is a part of avant-garde operaia.
Uh-huh.
So by the mid 70s, you have a point where vaguely Trotskyist football players are writing autobiographies, which are then being published, which is sort of a different kind of spectrum of document work going on.
So is that out now?
I think officially it comes out in May, but I can send you the PDF.
I've never read it, the Italian, so I look forward to seeing the translation.
Part of why we ended up doing it is because I asked Sandro Basadri about it, and he said that he carried a copy around with him in the 70s when he was going to matches.
Oh, okay. What, and read it instead of watching the matches, or?
I don't know, and this again is a total tangent, but I am sort of curious about the relationship between autonomy and football at this time.
I know that Negri was a fan of one of the Milan teams, but I can't remember which one it was. So
AC Milan, and if you can believe Wikipedia, he was one of the founders of Brigate Rosso, which is not the Red Brigades, but is the AC Milan Ultras Club.
Yep, and it's a black and red uniform, isn't it?
Yes, and there's one interview where Negri says that he's very upset with his daughter because she married an Inter fan. Basically, she married someone who supports the wrong team. It's like, oh dear. Now we're getting to the real important, the nitty gritty of class struggle. Anyways, but again, it's just part of this much broader milieu of how, I guess you'd say at that point, forms of fan culture and media production, for instance, that happen around football, are then embedded in part of a political culture.
Sure, and again, that's something I'd like to know more about. I mean, when I know what little I know about soccer and politics and far left politics is from a later period, from the 90s. So I don't really know much about that in terms of the 60s and 70s.
Well, it might be a good thing because if you knew a lot about it, your book would probably be about 10 times as long.
Oh, well.
No, it's a very good read, so it's certainly not complaining about that.
Oh, thanks for that. It has more jokes in it than Storming Heaven, although that's not saying much because Storming Heaven didn't have many obvious jokes, but at least in my mind, it's got more humorous moments, or intentionally humorous moments. I'm sure it's got many unintentionally humorous moments as well.
I think my favorite humorous moment is when Leopoldina is talking about she makes a puppet that looks like Negri.
Yep.
And brings it to make fun of him, and he gets really offended by it.
She first told me that story when I met her 40 years ago in Padova. And then when I interviewed her about 5 years ago, she brought it up again. I can't remember in the interview if I mentioned it. I don't think so. I think she was it's something that always stuck in her mind. So, and if you go in again in their publication in the organisation that she and the Della Costa sisters and others belonged to in the late 70s, there are one or two articles that refer to the brawling that they were in. Some of them were engaged with Negri and others around being able to teach or not to teach certain kinds of curricula at part of her at the time, because I think that was partly behind the confrontation between her and others, and Negri and others as well. Because I think, I could be wrong, but I think Della Costa was not allowed to teach certain things at some point. But I don't know the proper story, so I may have garbled that.
I think Arlen Austin is involved in translating some of these materials. So
yeah, well, if anyone knows, Arlen will know. Yep. So hopefully we'll hear from Arlen about that to get the proper lowdown that I've only got a little bit of.
Cool. Well, I think that gives us a sort of a good place to sort of maybe wrap up. I think your book is quite excellent. I think it gives us sort of a much different, or a sort of aspect of history of Operaismo autonomy that this sort of materials analysis of where stuff is coming from and how it's produced that really is important in understanding the history of these movements and how they developed. And I think it's a very, very good job. Very important that you sort of brought out these histories.
Oh, thanks for that. And I mean, there are certain friends who've influenced me. I mean, Ron Day, I just give a shout out to my friend Ron Day, because his work in translating people like Suzanne Brie into English made me conscious for the first time about 15 years ago of the whole documentalist tradition within information management. And that certainly influenced my whole approach. Because if it wasn't for the accident that I was employed researching and teaching information studies in a university, starting about 20 years, just over 20 years ago, I don't think I would have even conceived of approaching all of this from a quite different direction to how I did with Storming Heaven. So Ron's been one of the people who've been quite influential in that regard. So both my own lived experience and encountering perspectives that Ron and others have worked on made me think for the first time about 10 or 12 years ago about doing things differently and not just focusing upon the quote ideas that are in the content of text, but trying to think more broadly about how people literally work with documents. So it's only thanks to a number of other people that I even came up with the idea of trying to revisit what I would already engage with in terms of Operaismo and its history to try and think about the practices involved in seeking to get those ideas out to others and engage with them.
Cool. Yeah, I guess you could say broadly that shows that the tools we use, or tools in a broader sense, the tools we use in our everyday working lives really does shape how we view and understand the world. Which, for
sure, for me at least, for sure. Oh, well, thanks for taking the time. I do appreciate it. I should have thanked you at the beginning, but thank you, Stephen. I don't know who else you've interviewed yet, but having had Nick already on, I feel like it's a hard act to follow, and I'm pleased that you've had both of us to talk with. So I look forward to what you come up with in the future.
Cheers.
Alla lotta, fame o lavoro non vogliono più, non c'è da perdere, c'è un intero mondo da guadagnare. Via dalle mine, prendiamo il fucile,